He's a former commissioner of the now defunct Commission for the Implementation of the Constitution. Thank you for being with us. And Dr. Nyangasi, also a public policy consultant with us for the show. We thank you for making time. So appears to be a wide berth from senators, the executive sending a statement. They might appear tomorrow, one of them we'll see. But before we get to that, let me hear from you what you think about how devolution is faring 3 years on, because many people, different views we've had across the board. So what do you think?
I think, you know, devolution was the promise of our generation. On 3 instances, I think never before has the country seen so much hope. This was 1963, 2002, and I think during the constitutional referendum the enacting of the new constitution in August 7th. So even if you go by public polls, I think there are about 85% support for devolution in the country. So one of the major things the people of Kenya should begin to get comfortable with is the separation of the institution of devolution from the individuals implementing devolution, and these are the governors. I know there's been a lot of public dissent and disappointment in different areas and different capacities, but that doesn't mean you throw out the baby with the bathwater.
So it's still working for you, it's achieving intended goals, purpose?
Yeah, hatujalea mtoto bado vizuri. The child has just been, the child has been born, so let's give him some time to grow up.
All right, your thoughts were Ganja?
One, I think, let me start where you started by saying, let's not forget it's 3 years. You know, it's 3 years after 50 years plus of a centralized system. It's 3 years after a very disempowering political system. It's 3 years after a very inequitable system. And I think sometimes we expect too much, and that it's legitimate. But we shouldn't be naive to expect that we can undo that very, very quickly. So we must always remember the context. That's number one. Number two is also to know that devolution was about many things. It wasn't just about economic development. It was also about self-government, in quotes. If you remember in 2002, when Yash Polgai and his team went around this country, the one thing they said is that everywhere they went, people felt excluded. You know, they felt the government was far removed from them, and they were not like part of this country. You go today, even in Marsabit, even in Turkana, Isiolo, they may not be happy with their governor, but they will not say that they don't know that there's government. And that's important in terms of building a united country together. So that's one of the greatest benefits, despite its weaknesses, of devolution as is today, that it makes everyone feel that we are part of a Kenya. And so that's number one. Number two is the whole question of equity. The reality is that in those 50 years, there was a lot of inequity in the way we distributed resources. There were no rules that defined who got what. It was about siasa baya, maisha baya. What has happened is, because we have a rule-based system, it's not working perfectly, but at least it's a lot more predictable. It doesn't entirely depend on whether you vote for the government in power. So that is a positive thing. And then I think finally is the fact that people are making decisions at their level. Is it working perfectly? No. But at least the people of Busia, generally their leadership, is generally defining their priorities. Even if the priorities sometimes the assembly and the executive may not be in sync with where the people want to be, but at least it's a local problem, and that can only be a good thing. But there are obviously challenges.
There are obviously challenges. So largely, it is services closer to the people, a government that people can see is closer to them. Are there other things we are seeing that devolution has really brought out in as far as achieving, you know, that spirit of devolution in of itself?
You know, not just to keep talking up devolution, I mean, but from an economic perspective, many people forget that this was the largest economic redistribution program this side of the Sahara. In, I think it's about 1 trillion shillings over a span of 3 years. And a lot of people ask the question, especially if you go to the rural areas, hizi pesa zilikuwa wapi for 50 years, because they didn't see it. So devolution did achieve one of its main goals. And from an economic perspective, there are 2 main objectives of devolution: to increase allocational efficiency and to increase productive efficiency. Allocational efficiency means that the ground better understands the needs of the people in that area. So if you have 5 billion shillings and you give it to the people of Kwale, and you tell them, okay, you have this set of priorities, decide what you want. So they say, okay, we want a toilet here, we want a school here, we want some health services here, and what. So it defines, I mean, they set their own priorities. A long time ago, over the past 50 years, even though there were previous attempts at decentralization, not devolution, those, I think, the district focus for rural development, those a couple of times, but they never quite did achieve, for instance, what the local government did achieve what the devolution could achieve. So through elections and removal of errant leaders and public participation, the effect of priority setting has come back to the people of Kenya.
And I think, Sophia, there's also another element, which is that the focus increasingly in more and more counties of providing a forum for economic empowerment, you know, even for the local citizen is very, very important. If you look at, and again, sometimes it's very difficult to define devolution in one broad stroke because they're different experiences. We have 47 county governments. Exactly. So there are some that are working, some are struggling. But if you look at quite a good number of them, especially in the last 1 year, you hear they have a lot of programs for empowering the citizen. Even if we are not talking about the typical function of a county government, which is to provide service, but now ensuring that you're encouraging small-scale farming in particular areas, providing you know, incentives, all manner of incentives. I saw in Muranga even the county government even having rehabilitation programs for the young people. Those sorts of things would never in the previous administration have been decided on at a local level. It would have been decided on Nairobi. And sometimes the perspective of Nairobi on where the challenges of Lamu are and where the people of Lamu see the challenges are very, very different. So those are some of the softer issues that are sometimes not as obvious as we notice the big failures. Because failures speak a lot louder. But those softer things are very, very important for the eventual success of this baby that, as my colleague says.
So you've talked about money, and because several issues emerging as far as finances and financing devolution is concerned. On one hand, throughout the past 3 years, what we've had is we want more money. The Constitution has that threshold of it's 15%, is it?
Right.
The minimum.
The government has argued in and of itself, of its own goodwill, has gone way above that. Of course, there's the argument of the audited accounts and how that was being utilized in the 3 years we've seen. So is it that the Constitution got it wrong by putting that minimum? Should it have been higher? Because then we've had so many people calling out, we need more money.
I think to understand how the money works in terms of devolution, in Schedule 4 of the Constitution, basically outlines the transfer of functions. And there are a couple of subsidiary legislation that was supposed to implement this, provide the basis and the framework upon which these functions would be transferred. Personally, I think that one of the greatest failings of the framers was Schedule 6 of the Constitution, and the Transition to Devolved Government Act, where they created an opportunity for asymmetric devolution, which means they would devolve functions according to the capacity of the different areas. So this provided an opportunity for a lot of people who favored the central government type to delay and stop those functions being distributed. A good example would be, for instance, roads. I've seen some Class D roads are now being transferred to Class C, being changed so that they can retain the budget.
The chair of COG said so far 40,000 kilometers of road have been devolved.
So it was a teething problem. But when it comes to whether the funds so far are sufficient, they transferred, some functions were transferred without the funding. In fact, I think I saw a state corporations report saying that one of the major functions was in the devolution of some of the functions that are with state corporations. And since there's a lot of money tied up there, it needs a very clear framework on how to bring this money back to the ground. So I think the governors are complaining because they feel the biggest problem, the biggest heat from the citizens in terms of why isn't this road done, why isn't this done, why isn't this done? And yet they don't have the money to do it.
So allocation is not following devolution of funds, allocation of funds, you would argue, largely.
The three main functions that were transferred were health, agriculture, and housing. And I think whether the money has followed the functions transferred is questionable. I'll give you a good example. For instance, in health, before the new constitution came in, the apportionment of health sector financing was that supervision would retain 20% of the financing and 80% of the financing would go to service delivery. However, when the new constitution came in and all service delivery was devolved according to Schedule 4, Part 2, they didn't keep the same proportion of, it means they should have devolved 80% of healthcare financing. So what happened is that a lot of the money stayed in central government. In fact, I think the first budget was 46 billion, the second one became 59 billion, the third one 76. So the governors bear the brunt of service delivery, but the money hasn't yet completely come down. So I think that was one of the main problems.
Your thoughts, Ganjo, because the governors, even in terms of the delays, that's the other thing the COG chair was saying, huge delays in dispersing funds.
I think the part of this process is the failure of institutions, Sophie, because you see the Constitution provided a very elaborate mechanism for how a lot of these things will be resolved and ensured that the national government is not the one entirely in charge of this process. Because of course, the national government being the successor to the old central government would want to retain as much money as possible.
Right.
So that responsibility was given to a multiplicity of institutions. But what you have seen is a lot more infighting between those institutions than actually playing their role. Even the problem that my colleague is talking about the roads issue. Why haven't the roads issues been resolved? Because the National Assembly has refused to pass the necessary legislation. So you have a legislation that defines road in a particular way. And because members of parliament have traditionally been beneficiaries of that process, they have refused to pass the legislation. Even when the Transition Authority proposed the gazettement of the transfer of roads, the gazettement was rejected. So in a sense, part of it is a failure of institutions. If you look at even a very simple process like the division of revenue bill, that distributes the revenue between the national government and the county governments. 3 weeks ago, about a month ago, is when that bill was being discussed in Parliament. I counted the number of members of Parliament in the House. There were 17 members. Meanwhile, they were out there shouting, more money, let's go, pesa mashinani. But people are not playing their responsibility. If you go to the Senate, why isn't the Senate asking very real questions, the sorts of questions we are talking about? If you're talking about transferring 190 billion, it is not enough to talk about the amount, because the amount is not the issue. What is that money for? That money is about a service. What is the costing of that service? The costing of that service, you can do it historically and you'll see, why have we taken money before? We used to take it to supervision. If supervision is what has remained with the national government, then you retain that portion of the funding. So the problem has been the failure of institutions to play their responsibility. And a lot of this is because of the politics of devolution. The National Assembly, unfortunately, sees itself, its main responsibility is to weaken the counter governments, because they also see itself as a competitor for political power in the counties. So in a sense, if you listen to, even on that day, if you listen to the debate on the division of revenue, every member of parliament who stood up said, CDF did a lot better. In fact, they should give more money to CDF instead of giving to these governors.
Selfish interest.
It is actually selfish interest. And the problem with that is that what you're punishing is not governors. It is not MCAs. What you're punishing is the public. What you're punishing is the citizen. And what people forget, Sophia, is that Kenyans have been very patient over very, very many years on misgovernment and maladministration. They have given, I think, us a last hope in terms of devolution. If devolution doesn't deliver on the hopes of Kenyans, I don't know where Kenyans will go. And I think we must warn ourselves that all of us owe it to ourselves and to the future of this country for devolution to succeed. If this country is going to remain entity we are. Our greatest threat in this country, by the way, from where I sit, is not even ethnicity and corruption. It is if we don't deliver on the promise of devolution. Because I think, for me, that is the last phase that Kenyans are willing to give us. And so we owe it to ourselves. Those who sit in the National Assembly, it's not about we've given 15%. In any case, you don't give that money. That we've given, that is money that comes from citizens. You're just allocating it back to them. Your responsibility is just to divide what Kenyans have given you. It is not you who gives. And I think we need to move our thinking to recognize devolution is not about the governors we are competing with. That is the mentality we need to change.
Yeah, because that is worrying, because for many Kenyans, this politics and, you know, the rhetoric that we see spewed in rallies and all these meetings calling for more monies to counties, there's never this kind of arguments that we hear on the other side that, by the way, this is really what, you know, you've been taken for a ride. So what then is the hope for Kenyans in as far as making this devolution work?
I think devolution will succeed. Devolution is a bit like independence. You know, you couldn't, if you asked to do a results, you know, of independence after 3 years, you'd likely, you know, in 1966, you'd probably say it's a big mess. But one of the biggest problems with this whole process was like devolution was a very complicated process. It came from a very complicated background in terms of inequality, inter-ethnic equity, in terms of legislation, independent constitutions, and when the framers of the constitution were planning for this, they designed it in a very complex way. Part of my personal feeling was that some transition clauses should have been given more oomph and more power, because they're left to political will, and they waited for, you know, that if these people are good, and, you know, this is what you're expected to do, and, you know, that's overestimating.
I call it the naivety, the naivety of the framers of the Constitution.
Yeah, they thought everyone would be like, yes.
Depended too much on political will, and unfortunately, the result is this chaos. It looks like chaos, but eventually it will get a life of its own. It will get a balance, and I can see a couple of institutions are trying. They're relatively trying well. The Constitution Implementation Commission was certainly one of them, and tried to guide, you know, the whole process. I'm a bit sad about the Transitional Authority. If it was up to me, I would have allocated as much money as possible to the Transitional Authority, because they were the ones who would have guided the process into what it became. But this is not to say devolution has been a failure. I think a significant proportion of the economic growth we are seeing these days is dependent on.
That's true.
All right, and we'll talk about the senators not largely showing up to this particular conference, but I wanted to listen to the Devolution Cabinet Secretary Mwangi Kiunjuri, who is very optimistic in as far as how devolution is working, the functions being devolved, and the money as well following suit. Let's listen then.
Kenyans tend to take it for granted that we have had, by and large, a seamless transition without a major disruption of services. My ministry will take all the necessary steps to ensure that the committee completes the remaining tasks while fulfilling its mandate of serving the summit and implementing its decisions.
In discharging our responsibilities, we will adopt a multi-agency approach that will promote partnership and a pooling of skills and resources for efficient achievement of results.
So optimistic there about devolution and, you know, transition and how we've seen that play out. But, you know, CIC no longer in place. TA, as you said, Transitional Authority as well, no longer in place. And the people who said these two institutions should have continued to just allow and guide this process better.
Well, now
as commissioners, you had said you wanted to leave, so
yes, and that was because and that was because there's a very bad culture that was developing in this country where institutions want to stay forever. So actually, our proposal, if you read what we had proposed, we had said, you know, we still need a mechanism to oversee the implementation of the Constitution. What we are doing is we are removing ourselves from that mechanism, so that doesn't look like we are feathering our nest. But the reality is this, that what we have lost is not even so much the technical role of these institutions. If you look at the Commission, what the Commission did with all its failures is that it profiled the implementation of the Constitution. So the implementation of the Constitution was part of our national discourse at all times. And we kept reminding ourselves that there's a covenant we committed to in 2010. Let us look for our answers in that Constitution. The minute we removed the Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Affairs and the commission is not there, the question of the constitution increasingly goes to the back burner. And that cannot be good in terms of ensuring, because our constitution is still very, very young, to ensure that our constitution continues to be a reference point for the many challenges we are going to have, whatever those challenges are: contested elections, incompetent institutions, corruption, ethnicity. Those things have answers in the constitution. They may not be perfect, but they are there. So that is one of the problems. With the transition authority, the reality is that part of the naivety of this process is that everyone assumes that these things will just go lock, stock, and barrel and flow into each other. And I think we don't anticipate the level of political contestation that would be there, and the fight for space, you know, in the new constitutional framework. That fight for space needed an objective institution that is able to call people together. Right. The absence of that institution means that then people are left to fight, and the resolution of conflicts may take a little longer. The resolutions of very basic issues may take a little longer. Even if you take issues like the resolution on questions of division of money, a lot of those things, when you have a framework where it is not just the two parties that are fighting over, but you have other parties that have an objective view, is very, very important. So that is one of the mistakes we made. Okay. But we can still build from where we are. To say, look, these are countries together, we still need to move it to the next level. And the truth of the matter is that if you look at the function of the Senate of the first year and the Senate of this year, there has been some improvement, to give it credit, in terms of them recognizing their responsibility. One hopes that these will continue to improve as time goes on. Institutions like the Treasury, if you look at the Treasury of 2011 and the Treasury of 2014, it's a different institution also. It's also internalizing its role in a new constitutional framework. So one has to believe we'll get better with time.
All right, let's get to the senators, largely not, giving a wide berth to this particular meeting. And there are those who argue they should have been there, take the governors head on the issues they have, because then it appears some would argue they want those jobs because of what they come with. How do you see and interpret they're not showing up?
I think, you know what has happened over the past 3 years is when the Constitution was designed, it created a lot of, it was based on something called Jeffersonian democracy, where you have a lot of institutional checks and balances. So a lot of functions like Senate function was supposed to monitor devolution, and governors were created as an institution, devolution was as a check to the central government, and so many other different, ESCC and whatnot. So as my brother here is talking about the competition, this is the most evident competition between institutions, and there's a certain obsession in Kenya with budgets, like he who controls budgets just won, and that's why hence the CDF, hence all that. And I think for the senators it has been a bit difficult finding your political space in
the absence of budgets.
In the absence of budgets.
Of budgets.
So, I think about half of the senators are about to run for the governor's positions in the places.
But also one of the things they've argued is as far as accountability, and that's a big issue because we've seen some investigations, some governors even fighting their cases moving forward, is that the governors have been very resistant to account to the Senate, to appear even before those committees in the past. There has been that kind of push and pull, and accountability is huge because this is taxpayers' money.
Well, that's true, and I think there is a place for the Senate to play the role of holding the county governments to account. I mean, there's no question about that. And I think it's unfortunate that governors played into that, because then they were defined as trying to avoid and to refuse accountability. But I think what the legitimate point that the governors were raising is that the county governments are the ones that exist. The county assemblies are the ones at the first line of accountability by the governors. It is not the Senate. You see, what the Senate at some point started doing is looking like the way the National Assembly summons parastatal heads, and ministers, forgetting that the county governments are governments, and so they have their own mechanisms for accountability. It is when those mechanisms fail that the Senate steps in. It is when the Senate started almost taking over the role of the county assemblies that the challenge came about. But if I had been a governor, I'd have said, you're better off fighting the battle there than refuse. Because when you do, what it does, because the senators occupy a position, a profile that is able to define you in a particular way, it comes out, you'd rather appear and then raise the question. You'd rather appear there, raise the question and say, you know, my problem is not with accountability, but I cannot appear before my assembly. And then even before that is concluded, I'm appearing before the Senate. But the problem has, the other problem that arose, that a lot of the issues that were raised were actually also about particular senators going after particular governors for political reasons. And I think what you saw in play a lot of times is actually the governors fighting their senators, you know, who are using proxies in the Senate. Right. You remember the case of Muranga. When the governor was discharged, my good senator, my good friend said, you know, the Senate has failed. And so people started saying, is this an issue of? Yeah. So that is one of the underlying, the undertones that needs to be disabused, and which the Senate itself needs to disabuse. You know, I have no doubt that Senator Kembi Gitora meant well to hold the governor Wairia accountable. But the minute he raises an issue like that, people start thinking this is now politics, which is not good. Right. But from where I sit, I would have preferred as a governor that you held yourself to account and then raise the issues.
It's very interesting because it's actually a very delicate balance about whether by the governor showing up there, it undermines the whole institution of devolution, and whether by showing up there, it gives the opportunity and the platform to the senator to do what he should. So, and unfortunately, there's no one else that will settle that dispute between the central government can't do it, the institutional commissions cannot do it. It is those two institutions have to battle this out.
You know, the only good thing I can tell you that in the minds of Kenyans, there is nobody who doubts on the supremacy issue. Why is it that there's no governor wanting to go to become a senator and every senator wants to become a governor? It just tells you that people understand. So that's why I'm saying from the governor's perspective, you had nothing to prove. Because in the case we've recognized.
Right. I want to read some of your views before we go on break. We have Michael Tooks. You're saying devolution has been good to most people. They have felt the fruits, or rather seen the fruits. Soldier Boy, as people crying on corruption in national government, governors have taken an advantage of mismanaging our money. Dickens Nyamogo, it has underperformed because the national government fears a financially empowered, devolved government. All right. Emmanuel Asava, you say it has molded cartels into economic bandits. Litunia George, the father of devolution.
He's supposed to be the strongest proponent for some of these things, devolution, because they are in their infancy stage. So the effect of a statement like that was ineffectually campaigning against devolution, because he's aware of the challenges, he's aware of the intricacies and the nuances he's talking about.
Campaigning against devolution, that's strong.
I mean, he had the whole parliament responding no to every word. It sounds a lot like a campaign speech. Yeah. So, so part of the net effect is that it continues the adversarial relationship between the central government and the county governments. Because I think I saw the chair of the county governments today responding that, you know, what do you mean you've given us money? You haven't given us money. So you can see the attitude between the central government and the county government, while they weren't necessarily supposed to be in competition, even though even countries that have had devolution for 200 years, like the United States, still have this competition between state rights and what, but it's not as adversarial as that. But I think in the general perspective of the public, the president should maybe have displayed a bit more father of the nation kind of.
Father of the nation, when his argument is money is not being seen to.
No. But you can make that same argument for the central
It's a distinction. It's a distinction between the president. The president is not the president of the national government. You know what I mean? The president is the president of the country. You know what I mean? So the failure of devolution is actually the failure of the president. You know what I mean? In that broad sense. So in a sense, whereas members of the National Assembly may see themselves as, you know, differently, and in competition,
they belong to,
and they are competing with the governors. The president is not in competition with governors. You know what I mean? So in a sense, I agree that there's a level at which that statement, even if it is true, even if it is partly true, is not helpful, because actually those things could be said. I mean, the national government and the central government have in charge of those facilities. How are the state of those facilities before 2010? They were deplorable. They were deplorable.
Interestingly, though, that relationship is actually good for democracy. it is good for the development of these institutions when each of them is trying to find their own space in the new constitution. And that so over a long period of time, you find some form of balance. I can see like the Intergovernmental Budget and Economic Council has now formed that platform where at least they iron out these very aggressive positions they have.
And many of the tweets tonight, many people saying what they have seen devolved largely is corruption, money being taken. And let's talk about that for a second, because it's something at the national level as a country we have been grappling with. So when we're talking about devolution, you devolved corruption and negative practices as well. What is it that needs to happen? Because in terms of accountability, who's holding these governors to account? Because we've seen some of them, cases upon appeals, and everyone has a right to do that. But when allegations of corruption are brought, there's always all of this, pushback. And the concern for Kenyans is, at the county level is this is, same story. There's not going to be a change. It's just a bigger problem. Now it's still big, but also all manifests in the smaller level of counties. Yeah?
Maybe, I think part of the problem in this country is that we talk a lot about corruption as a useful dinner conversation, but I don't think it's something we interrogate very, very seriously. You see, let's talk about, for example, now let's first accept that there is corruption in the county governments. I mean, anyone who says there is not doesn't live in this country. Of course there is. But if we accept that, unfortunately, that corruption has almost become part of our DNA, and by the way, not just in government, in the private sector, we're actually talking about how to reduce it, not to eradicate it. How do we ensure that it doesn't finish us completely? I think one of the consequential effects of devolution is that the accountability mechanisms, and I'm not talking about the formal accountability mechanism, I'm talking about even the informal accountability mechanisms, are very loud. It is a lot more difficult for the governor of Kisumu to utilize health money badly, significantly, without the people of Kisumu banning his office. And I'm not recommending. It is true. It is a lot more easier for the Minister for Health if you are to spend money and explain it away. People will never understand how that process works. When you break down that budget into small pieces in 47 counties, it actually automatically reduces waste. It doesn't eliminate it, but it automatically reduces it. Let me give you an example. 3 years ago, I go to a country which I shall not name. There's a dam in that country that had been funded for about 3 years, for about 300 million shillings. No work had started on the dam. Now, you say in that county that the government has put in 300 million shillings and people can't see a dam, you'll have riots. So some of these accountability mechanisms are actually reducing the level of corruption, because also the amount of money available is also not that huge. For you to be able to corruptly receive significant monies in the county governments is difficult, because the budget figures are also small. The projects are also small. At the national level, that is very easy, because to lose 1 billion shillings in the national, nobody feels it. You lose 1 billion shillings in the county, it's a lot more difficult. So what I'm saying is that, yes, there's corruption, but the structural processes that are reducing it. What we need to do is we need to keep asking the questions. Have we gone wrong on our institutional mechanisms for fighting corruption? And if we have, why don't we try and resolve there? Let's not assume that we are going to resolve it in any other way, unless we are going to be building the institution. And if they are wrong, let us strengthen them. Anything else is just going to be interesting talk as we move on. In fact, a lot of times we'll be talking because we are concerned, we are complaining about not getting a peace. But if we are really serious, then we need to invest very seriously in institutional mechanisms for reducing it.
Because you have some counties that have the cosmopolitan, bringing different ethnic groups together. But a concern also with devolution has been, say, for example, in employment, you'll find that whether it's hospitals or whatever, they consider the major or dominant ethnic group in those counties. So on one hand, as you have the conversation about inclusivity and ensuring that we are all one people, isn't devolution as well double-edged in that sense?
It's good to remember that everything is new in terms of even what he's talking about, the new institutional mechanisms. A lot of like the ex-ante and ex-post controls, like the
control of budget.
Those are completely new offices. So when you talk about inclusivity, something like the County Public Service Board is also a new. Is also something new, and in a lot of these counties, there's absolutely no capacity for professionalism and all that. So as to whether it has engendered tribalism, and that, I think that's just the effect of the initial phase of devolution. In time, you'll see capacity deficits, human resource. You know, if you need engineers, there's nothing you can do. If you don't have them in your county, you know, you can't force an engineer out of nowhere. Yeah. So eventually, over time, those resource gaps are going to show, and I think it's going to achieve some form of balance in time. It's not a completely terrible thing, this ethnicity. It has some form of ethnic identity, and it has some positive aspects to it. But I think to the effect it had on our history, maybe that's bad. But in terms of the Public Service Board, I wouldn't see it as a very serious problem for the country.
All right, so as we bring this to a close, in terms of the national government and the relationship it has with the county governments, and you both talked about that, what is it that is required to make sure that it's not as adversarial as it has been? Is it toning down the rhetoric? Is it, what exactly do we expect to see or need to see? Because as you were saying, there sometimes appears to be a feeling by those in national government that there is national government somewhere, then there's Kenya, then there's the 47 counties. Like national government is one of the counties, but a bigger county in essence.
I go back to institutions. Maybe I'm a structuralist, but I do think that there's a place for us to use existing institutions. And I keep saying that a lot of our answers are going to be found within the institutions created under our constitutional framework. It helps to tone down the rhetoric because it creates the environment where the institutions work. There are numerous institutions that the Constitution anticipated to resolve issues between national and county governments. The summit, for example, it now meets almost because the law requires it to meet once in a year. So it must meet. In fact, it meets towards the end of the year when I think someone realizes the time is about to run out, let's have a meeting. But the intention for that was to facilitate closed-door conversations between these leaders. The IBEC, for example, the Intergovernmental Budget Economic Council, is supposed to resolve the financial issues before they even go before the House. The other technical teams within the ministries, what are called the intersectoral teams, again, those are supposed to be working. A lot of those are not working. And I think the failure of that, and then when you add the rhetoric, it doesn't help. But I would say that we still need to invest, especially in these early years, to ensure that these institutions are working. A lot of these disputes that are being mentioned today in this conference never need to go before a conference. They actually would have been discussed within boardrooms and resolved. Because that is what is going to move us forward. It is not this continuous adversary. There is need for adversity. But if the adversity is prejudicing our ability to deliver to the citizen, then that is not healthy.
It's counterproductive. Your final words?
Yeah, I think just to reinforce what he says, the future and the hope of this country lies in its institutions. That one is, to the extent that the central government can prop up some of these and provide the support that's required, because they're the custodians and guardians of the Constitution, they should do so. But as he says, maybe the adversarial relationship is not in the benefit. It just prolongs the period of the position that we'll eventually get to. So, yeah.
And there's a question somebody was asking about the Ministry of Devolution and asking, why is there a ministry that is charged with that? I lose that tweet now, but it was in the line of, even when it comes to allocation of funds, at that times, it's ministries that are charged with disbursing the funds. Why not Treasury?
I think, again, these are misunderstanding. You see, whatever you call a ministry, what you look is what are its functions. The Ministry of Devolution's role is to advise the national government on matters to do with the devolution. It is not an intergovernmental ministry. You know, and there is no money that goes to the Ministry of Devolution on devolved services. You know what I mean? And the monies that come from the institution that resolves financial issues is actually in the National Treasury. So some of that is not helpful. We as a commission had proposed it be called the intergovernmental. As opposed to devolution, it would have been a more useful. You see, devolution sort of looks like the Ministry of Local Government, the old Ministry of Local Government to oversee counties. But if you look at its role, it actually does not oversee counties. In actual fact, it advises the national government and the presidency on matters to do with devolution. So it's more about semantics than reality. Though in this process, semantics become critical, as I have come to realize.
Kamoda Waiganjo, who's former commissioner of the now defunct Commission for the Implementation of the Constitution, and also with us tonight was Dr. Nyangasi Squared, who's a public policy consultant. And we thank you so much for your feedback tonight, your sentiments, how you feel devolution has fared, because it's all about a conversation involving all, and it's up to you to ensure you hold your leaders to account at your local levels, and most importantly, when it comes to next year's general election, if you feel those particular individuals in power now have not done you justice and you think there's a different person, the power is in your hands. The promulgation of the Constitution of Kenya 2010 ushered in, of course, a totally new experience for Kenyans. That is devolution. And by overwhelmingly voting to bring about devolution, Kenyans were definitely, again, eager to reap the benefits of that, what come with this system of governance. Now, with all due respect to what the country has so far achieved, it is clear a lot would have been realized by now if there was no too much politicization of the processes. In the same breath, the national government and the county governments urgently need to strike a rapport and exploit the same for better management of devolution. And